JSP 3rd Gen Prelude episode number 9. In this episode, we begin reassembling the engine bay after paint from the last episode. I'm going to go over some of the small details that I like to focus on when reassembling an engine bay to make sure that it looks as good as possible. After putting as much time and effort as you have and as we have into our project cars, we want to make sure that there isn't those little details that are taking away from all of the fresh components that we put on this car. For example, a lot of times people will repaint an engine bay and then just put their old dirty wiring harness back in, or their old dirty overflow reservoirs, or their old headlights, or you get the idea. The point here is to make sure that the time and effort that goes into reinstalling all of the components that you took off doesn't take away from all of the work that you've put in so far. Some of the key areas that I like to focus on are the things that are most exposed in the engine bay. That would include things like the plastic housing headlights or the wiring harness that runs along the strut towers. These are the things that make the biggest difference in the overall look of the engine bay besides the paint. I'm also just going to kind of give you guys an update of where we are as a status on this car. What we have done so far, what's still left to do, and why is there no engine. Let's get started. The first thing I want to focus on are the headlights. When you open the engine bay of your car, the first thing that you're going to see are going to be the headlights and the tops of the headlights, as they're the very front of the engine bay. Since this car was a daily driven car that was always parked outside, these headlights were pretty rough. Now they're not as good as new, but they're much better than they were. Let me show you what I did to bring them back to life. The first thing to notice is that a lot of headlights like this have a black trim line painted on the top edge. This is one of the first things to go when they start to fade. Restoring this trim line on a plastic headlight is very simple. Just requires a little bit of sanding to remove the old paint, some masking to protect the headlight, and then a couple of light coats of trim paint. I like to use this Duplicolor trim and bumper paint. It works really well. One thing to note though is that it's actually a very thin paint, so it's going to take multiple coats before it starts looking black. When you start applying it, it comes out a little bit clear and thin. Don't worry about it, just spray a layer at a time, let it tack up and dry for about 10 minutes and keep adding layers. When you're done, it gives this nice, smooth, somewhat matte finish that looks very OEM. Another thing to focus on is just the housing itself. So these plastic headlights were pretty faded and really covered in dirt and grime. And a little bit of warm water and soap goes a long way when it comes to cleaning this stuff up. I like to use a little bit of Dawn soap and just lightly scrub until you can get all of the dirt away. If it's still faded, then you can use a little bit of Back to Black or another plastic restorer to bring the black finish back. One area that's often overlooked is all the stuff that's underneath the bumper. You think that you can't see it when the bumper's on, so it's very easy to disregard everything that's under here. But trust me, when you look down from the top or through the bumper vents, you're gonna see anything that you skipped. I like to take the time to strip and repaint as much stuff as possible. These bumper brackets were an original grayish color, like kind of a primered color, and I didn't really like the way that it looked, so I decided to sand them down and paint them black. I'm also trying to use new zinc-plated hardware everywhere that I can. A lot of the hardware that was on here was already mismatched from the car being taken apart and put together a couple of times. And putting new zinc-plated hardware really has that extra sort of pop look against all of the black things that I've been putting back on. Along with repainting the bumper bracket is also the air conditioning condenser. All of the air conditioning lines that were painted were repainted, and then all of the air conditioning lines that were aluminum unpainted, I decided to clean up, sand, and Scotch-Brite them to give them a new shine again. Another thing that I wanted to focus on was the chassis wiring. All of the split loom and electrical tape that was on here before was coming off, damaged, cracking, etc. So I wanted to go back in and not only clean everything, but re-loom and re-tape everything. This is not just so that it looks nice, but also as you're driving your car around, you want to make sure that all the moisture and water and dirt and debris on the road doesn't get into the wiring harness, because that moisture can cause corrosion and a lot of problems down the line. Well, I've got most of the chassis harness and the fender wells all rewrapped and finished. There's still some more things that I need to work on, like the side marker lights that were spliced into the original harness. This is not going to be okay. I need to rewire all of this correctly into the body harness. Before reassembling the suspension, I wanted to put an undercoating in the fender wells. I sanded it all down and sprayed it with a bed liner spray that I got from AutoZone. The spray is called Herculiner. I think it's about $10, and it goes on in a couple of coats and does a really good job of hiding any of the imperfections in the paint and the underside. It will also protect it from rock chips and those types of things as you're driving, so that it'll maintain a nice finish throughout. As I mentioned, I'm trying to put new zinc hardware everywhere that I can, because all of the old hardware that was in this engine bay was not in good condition. And so the options were to try to match it all together, send it out for replating, or just replace all the hardware with new hardware. Luckily, because we sell a lot of automotive parts here, we do have a pretty good selection of hardware that I get to pick from. One thing to note about installing new hardware on fresh paint is that if you don't use a flat washer underneath the hardware, you can end up damaging the paint surface when you tighten the bolt down. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I wasn't able to fit flat washers on this core support brace right here, and as you can see, around the edge of the bolt, the paint pushes out the sides as you tighten it down. But if you do use a flat washer underneath the bolt, when you tighten it down, the washer stops and the bolt spins against the top of the washer instead of spinning against the paint, causing damage. Moving further into the engine bay, the cross member itself was removed from the car before I painted it. So before I put it back in, I removed the complete steering rack assembly and all of the lines and hoses on it, sanded it down, and then repainted it with a semi-gloss black paint. This, again, will seem kind of redundant, like, oh, I'm not going to see the cross member once the engine is in, but you'd be really surprised that even when the engine is in the car, that cross member, if it were dirty, would be really sticking out from behind and taking away from all of the other clean stuff that you've done already. Because I wanted to put this Mugen airbox in here, and also this strut bar, I ended up having to relocate the brake proportioning valve. This brake proportioning valve, this bolt here, used to be way up here. And what that did is put the proportioning valve right where the intake tube needed to pass through. And so it was hitting the proportioning valve. Also, it was really close to the strut bar when it was up here. And so what I ended up doing is trimming all of the hard lines, rebending them, moving the brake proportioning valve back. And I'm going to put some pictures here of doing the nutserts so that these M6 screws actually screw into the strut tower into new holes that have threaded inserts. Originally, I was on the fence about what to do with this one air conditioning line that runs along the strut tower. It's not super ugly, but it also takes away from the white paint on the engine bay. In the end, I think it's better to leave it and just clean it up rather than trying to relocate that air conditioning line with something that's custom. As you can see though, before putting it all back on, I cleaned all of the foam insulation, I painted the brackets that hold it down, and put new hardware. I also followed the line down, and then the part of the air conditioning line that is copper was polished, and all the fittings were sanded and all of the dirt and grime removed before reinstalling. Another new addition is the clutch master cylinder. The original clutch master cylinder that was in here, I don't know if it was a factory unit, but it looked kind of like a factory unit where it stuck out and then it had a hose that ran over here somewhere to an external reservoir. Instead of having that separated setup, this clutch master cylinder is from a Honda S2000, and it's not bolted in just yet, so I can show you. But the bolt pattern that attaches onto the car turns out to be the same as the Honda Prelude. So no modifications there, just slides in, and what it gives you is a more compact brake master cylinder that has an integrated reservoir. So this will tuck behind the intake manifold and clean up the look of the engine bay so that you don't have an extra reservoir sitting over by the brake master cylinder. Some other details are, for example, before reinstalling the wiper motor, I cleaned the connectors with hot water and soap to get all of the grime out of them. These white connectors, well, they were originally white when they were new, are real hard to get the yellowing out of, but if you do remove as much dirt and grime as possible, they can look aesthetically okay. The brake master cylinder looked pretty new, so I just put that back in, and I repainted the brake booster before putting that back in with a semi-gloss paint. Another new addition to the engine bay are these new JSP radiator brackets that we started making. These are billet units that have new rubber grommets. The best part about these is that on my car, for example, the rubber insulators that are on the factory radiator bracket were torn, worn out, and just not really fitting tightly on the radiator. They were real sloppy, so the radiator wiggled around a lot. But these new brackets come with new grommets, and because they are billet, add a nice contrast to the freshly painted engine bay. What I'm currently working on is the chassis wiring on the passenger side. This includes the engine wiring harness connecting into the car for the ECU, and also, like I mentioned in one of our earlier videos, I'm relocating the fuse box. This was so that we could fit this Mugen air box behind the headlight. So what I've done so far is all of the wiring for the fuse box used to run along the fender well through this hole and mount into the fuse box. We removed all of that wiring out of the fuse box so that we could reroute it through the fender well. It was all pulled back through the fender well and fed back through the fender here. And I'm gonna route the harness along the top, and I'm going to mount the fuse box about here behind the strut bar. While relocating this fuse box isn't a huge undertaking, it does require a little bit of patience and some extra work. For example, while most of the harness was able to just flip over and reroute back, some of it was not long enough after it was flipped over. For those wires, what I did was I put some masking tape on and labeled them and then cut them. What this does is it helps you to identify all of the wiring that needs to be extended. For example, these two blue wires are labeled with a B, and if I follow it along the harness, we can come back over here and find these two wires again with a B on them. And so to extend those two wires, I just have to extend off of this end, follow along the wiring harness, and reconnect to the letter B. Sometimes this sounds very simple, but it's often overlooked. People assume that they're going to be able to remember based on wire colors and things like that. But if you take your junction of wiring where it's cut, again, this is our A extension, these wires right here, follow it over to the front and look for our A wires that we need to connect to. This will take away a lot of headache, especially if you're not doing it all in one sitting. I haven't touched this wiring in about 3 weeks or so, so if I hadn't labeled them all, I probably would be getting a little messed up when I'm trying to put it back together. So that brings me to one of the first issues that I've run into on this car. Now, this car has a wireworx engine swap wiring harness. I'm not super familiar with this company, and when I went on their website, they did not have a diagram for this wiring harness on how to connect it. The previous owner said that he were able to get it to run on like starter fluid or brake fluid or whatnot. But when I dove into the wiring harness, I found that their sub harness had a bunch of wires that had not been connected to anything. And this is the factory engine harness, has a bunch of splices and cuts in it. I think that there's going to be some more that I need to get from wireworx to understand where this extra loom is going to connect. Another issue that I found with, I'm not sure if this is an issue with the wireworx harness itself or not, but when you lay out the engine harness across to where the engine is going to be, and you run the loom back through the fender and try to go back down into where the factory ECU connects, the wiring harness is actually quite short. Let me show you here. So this is about what we got to go back into the car. So once you route it back in here, you've only got about 10 inches to go in, which isn't enough to reach into the floor pan area where the ECU is mounted. Now, the previous owner, what they did was they drilled a hole into the firewall here and just shoved the wiring harness through it. But that area where that hole is not ideal. There's a bunch of other brackets and stuff back behind there that can chafe the wiring harness. So I'm gonna see if I can't reach out to wireworx and see what the solution to this is. I would rather not have a hole in the firewall there, and I would rather run the wiring harness through the fender well and into the body through this hole in the side here like the factory wiring. But that's something that I'm going to have to figure out. One other thing that I was able to pick up for the engine bay on this car was this Mugen radiator cap that I got from Krager's Headers. Again, Krager's just always has all of that cool, random, rare stuff that you need for your project. Go check it out. So that leaves us with what's going on with the engine. The last time that we saw our H22, we realized that the cylinder walls were scarred and we weren't going to be able to use the short block. What I ended up doing was picking up a Japanese short block. So what we have here is the Japanese H22A closed deck short block. From what I can tell just by looking at the outside, the engine blocks are real similar. This is also a closed deck design like the H22A1. The only difference I was able to find online is that the US spec model is a 10-to-1 compression and the Japanese spec model is a 10.6-to-1 compression. It's pretty apparent if you just compare the look of the two pistons. These US pistons are pretty flat with the top of the deck, and these Japanese spec pistons have a little bit of a dome that sticks up above the top of the deck. So this engine block, I'm gonna pull the oil pan off and inspect the bearings. The cylinder walls look pretty good in it. The pistons are gonna need a little bit of cleaning, but overall, I think this is probably the easiest solution for refreshing our H22 after finding out that the cylinder walls were damaged in the original engine. So that's where we're at now with the 3rd Gen Prelude. So the engine block needs to be cleaned up, inspected, reassembled. We're also going to take the cylinder head to Arlington Machine to have it refreshed. Once we get that head back, then we can reassemble it on the short block, begin assembling the engine so that we can finally put the engine back in the car. Thanks for watching. See you guys next time.